Well, good morning to you for those of you who are on the call this morning. We've got a number of parties still to join us, so we'll kick off in approximately 30 seconds. Thank you for joining us, and we'll start with some introductions in 30 seconds. Okay, let's kick things off. So welcome this morning to the Aglive GS1 Supply Chain Insight session. Today we're going to be looking at producer and processor and export perspectives from farm to overseas markets. If this is a live webinar, so we've got a number of people who are still joining the call now. We'll kick off. Next slide, please. My name is Peter Carter, and I'm the moderator for the session today. And so a little bit of background. I grew up on a family farm in Crookwell, New South Wales. I developed a background in agricultural economics, and I'm passionate about digital transformation, and particularly as it relates to supply chain. In GS1, I lead the innovation program and the solution provider partnership. And today I'm very happy to be able to support Aglive, is one of many organisations committed to improving the way our supply chains work. Prior to joining GS1, I led the CSIRO and Data 61 National Mission on Supply Chain Integrity. So my role today is to provide you with some guidance. I will provide a short introduction and some perspectives from GS1. We might just look at the agenda if we can, please. Next slide. So today what we're going to do is we're going to provide you with an industry briefing on developments in the region that relate to supply chain modernisation, obviously in the red meat industry. We're going to look at some developments in China. We're going to touch on the topic of data integrity that's becoming increasingly critical. We'll hear from a producer, and then we'll throw to Aglive before we take some questions. Now, just some house rules for the day. We've got lots of people that have just joined the call, which is wonderful. We are going to use the chat channel, so I'd encourage you through the session to put forward your ideas and to raise some questions. And when we get to the discussion session, we'll touch on each of those separately. So the session is to be recorded, and so play nice. And with that, if we could just move to the next slide, and we'll kick off the first session. First of all, I'd like to introduce a few of our guests today. So speaking in the session and taking your questions will be Charlie McDonald. Now, Charlie's the Chief Information Officer at Aglive. He brings some very interesting perspectives to the problem we're discussing today, drawing on experience from Telstra, from DHL, and DB Schenker. Charlie's also spent quite a lot of time in China in recent years, so he'll be sharing us some insights on what he's learned around supply chain and what's happening in that part of the world. We have Liz Pearson, who's also joining us. Liz is the Commercial Supply Chain Manager at Angus Australia. Liz is passionate about the beef industry and thrives on helping people realise the business potential. She has extensive experience in supply chain developments from a producer as well as a processor and feedlot production systems perspective. She's been involved in marketing and sales throughout the beef industry. We also have Pierre de Ferreira, who's also from Aglive. Now, Pierre is a software engineer, and he's responsible for the architecture and the development of the Aglive platform. He also draws on extensive information from different parts of the red meat supply chain, including his most recent role with LumaChain. So we have one other speaker who's also going to join us via a recorded link and a video. He's one of our producers, Robert McKenzie, who's from Macca's Australian Black Angus, and he's going to be talking about his experiences through the session today as well. And his operations are based in North Coast, New South Wales. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what we're seeing happen in global traceability and trade. Next slide, please. Firstly, a little bit about GS1. So many of you know what GS1 is, even if you haven't heard the term before. So all of those barcodes that appear on all of the fresh produce and fast-moving consumer goods that you see in our retail outlets, those codes have been in place for well over 50 years now. So it's actually 1973 when the first codes were put on some juicy fruit chewing gum. Now, throughout the years, that standard has become critical for supply chain traceability. So what GS1 does is an independent, non-for-profit global organisation is work with industry to issue keys that are unique to identify products, but also properties and locations and assets, etc., that are relevant in the supply chain. So next slide, please. GS1 is a very large organisation. It's a very well-kept secret in some respects. It's remarkable. It's got more country offices than the United Nations. And through these networks, we're able to support industry to facilitate effective, efficient and safe trade. So in Australia, GS1 represents over 22,000 businesses and globally more than 2 million. So if you're a GS1 member because you have a barcode, there's every possibility that you're also dealing with another GS1 member on the other side of the world if you're an exporter. So increasingly, GS1's been very actively involved in discussions and support for government about the way our supply chains work, and particularly how we tackle some of the complexities around issues like pandemics and supply chain disruptions. Next slide, please. GS1 in Australia focuses on 20 odd industries, and today we're going to concentrate on fresh produce and specifically red meat. So in other parts of the world, and certainly in Australia right now, GS1's playing a very active role in supporting healthcare and the distribution of vaccines as a provider of standards. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. So the themes that we typically focus on are efficiency and cost, quality and safety, fighting illicit trade and counterfeiting, but also traceability as a means to achieve a more sustainable production and consumption system. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more about GS1 standards. So best way to think about this is that iceberg analogy is all you really see is what's sitting above the waterline. What sits above the waterline is typically barcodes. So what barcodes do, and there are many different kinds of identifiers, from the very simple zebra stripes that we've all been familiar with since the 70s, but nowadays two-dimensional codes. This is very important because two-dimensional codes carry much more information. And that's really relevant to the conversation we're going to have with our panelists today. In particular, information that customers may be looking for. So GS1 is playing a really important role in data carriage. On the right-hand side, there are 3 areas where GS1 standards apply. First of all, for the identification of things, that makes sense. If we have multiple codes that are the same, systems like Amazon and eBay just would fall apart. But it's the same for red meat. If red meat products are appearing in one part of the world with the same codes and identifiers, we have some serious issues, and we have delays, and we have product spoilage, and we have loss of revenue. So GS1 also then enables the capture and the sharing of that information. So why is this important? Well, below the waterline, what this allows us to do is to manage product registries, location registries, food recall systems, provide data sharing services, messaging protocols, and lastly, GS1 also has a very sophisticated supply chain event language. And we're going to hear much more about this in the next few years, because this supply chain event language, it's not complicated. It's like I harvest, I pack, I ship, I store, I sell. those events increasingly are becoming a real focus for government that's seeking to find ways to automate the way that, say, biosecurity works and trade clearance works. And we'll provide some examples of that. Before we move on to this slide, I'll just point out two things. Is the product registries are vast. Is that retailers in Australia share information with their suppliers extensively across millions of products. So if you think of all of the Woolworths and the Coles stores in the country, they don't ship spreadsheets to one another with product information. They subscribe to national services to do that. And the global registries that GS1 support are also very extensive, involving hundreds of millions of products. And all of this is freely available, as I'll explain in a minute. Next slide, please. Australian red meat industry is actually a very mature adopter of global data standards. Now, for producers on the call, it may not be completely apparent how that is the case. However, the Australian red meat messaging system is one of the world-leading examples of how data is being shared through the supply chain for efficiency and safety. So what do we mean by that? It's really about labelling and standards around how data is conveyed through the supply chain. Now, typically, for those of you in the producers, in the processor side, you'll know exactly what we're talking about here. It's about effective trade clearance. We want to make sure that those cartons of meat that are being shipped to America or China are not being held up in the border, or that they're not being relabeled because the local legislation requires a different form of identification. So GS1 works very actively to support industry to make sure that trade clearance and the alignment of what we do fits well within the customs authorities and the biosecurity agencies of our trading partners. Lastly, before we move on this slide, I think the two pictures on the right are really important. I know how hard it is as a producer keeping records and reporting to state and federal agencies around chemical use. Well, chemical manufacturers are actually really big users of global data standards. And in the future, we're likely to see much more sophisticated on-pack coding, and heavens above, we're well overdue making it easier for producers to capture the information about the chemicals that are being used to develop better solutions for vendor declarations. And on the right, we also see Woolworths, one of the world's first rollout of data matrix, which is a new form of barcode. You're already seeing that in the supermarkets, and they're already rolling that out for a range of other products, including seafood and poultry products. So you're seeing standards at both ends of the supply chain. Next slide, please. So what are the developments we're seeing in the region? Well, I just want to touch on four of them. We're seeing increased risk profiling. We're seeing a focus on government trying to be more efficient through regulatory automation. We're seeing some real focus on traceability, including the work that Aglive are doing, and also regional cooperation. So I'd just like to touch on each of these briefly. Risk profile. Next slide, please. Okay, I won't speak to this slide in a lot of detail. I'll summarize it. So GS1, because of the work that we do to assist members identify products, what that is allowing is customs authorities in other countries, once they have a track record of who owns those products, is to start automating and streamlining trade clearance. Now, this is really important. So historically and to this day, customs authorities will be looking for an HS code. Now, HS codes are very broad. And HS codes won't mean very much to you if you're a producer. If you're a processor or an exporter, you'll know all about it. It's a classification system, and it's at a high level. Now, in many countries, because the HS code is a high-level classifier, if they can't get the specificity they need to have effective biosecurity. So what they're increasingly doing is saying, no, we need to know what sort of meat product this is. Now, GS1 codes are making that possible. So what we are increasingly doing with the support and consent of the brand owners is we're sharing that information about products so that products can be pre-cleared before they get held up for customs inspection. So the Green Lane programs and the Trusted Trader programs, they're moving ahead very, very quickly, along with some ambitious government programs involving blockchain and distributed ledgers and single ledger arrangements. So next slide, please. Risk profiling is a huge focus for the Australian government. The second thing that's happening is now that we have better access to information about product, including its branding, its label definition, the market that it's designed for, etc., is that we can start automating more effectively clearance processes. So this is something that GS1's working with customs authorities and trading organisations, APAC, ASEAN nations, United Nations agencies, Australian Border Force, etc., to modernise the way that we're processing information. And this is having a significant benefit for processors. So already we're seeing biosecurity certificates being automated, country of origin declarations being automated, bill of lading needs to be automated. And we need to do this because if our trading competitors are moving ahead quickly, we will be in a disadvantage if all of our transactions are supported by paper. Next slide, please. The third thing that's happening, and we'll talk specifically about this because Charlie McDonald's experience in China is very relevant here, is that countries like China are moving ahead very quickly. Since 2012, GS1 in China have been supporting Chinese government with the development of traceability systems to provide cold chain visibility. Now, this is very relevant for Australia at the moment, given the developments and the complexities over the last 12 months. So what does that mean? It's simply the application of the two slides that we've previously looked at, is that Chinese authorities are also concerned about biosecurity. The very significant growth in middle class and disposable income means that consumers are looking for a wider range of imported product. So government are improving the way that their risk profiling is being managed. And that's creating opportunities, particularly for companies that are digitizing. So at the moment, General Administration of Customs receives data from GS1 in China provided by GS1 in Australia with the consent of the meeting exporting companies to assist in the trade clearance process. This is really important because there are at least 14 other trading countries that are doing the same thing. So not to be involved in these sorts of initiatives puts trading partners in a really significant disadvantage. And this is not a one-way thing. This is also available for Australian importers, etc. as well, and Australian customs authorities. Next slide, please. This is the last one I'll touch on, and I won't go into much detail. Trade collaboration is a real theme at the moment. The sense is that no one party can make an improvement that's going to deliver significant benefits without the other party involved. So complexities around shipping, port communities, data sharing. There are many projects that are in motion that GS1 is supporting, where industry is typically taking the lead to try and remove bottlenecks. And the way that we're typically doing that is using some of the tools that I mentioned earlier, like the supply chain event language, to provide the information that's helpful. Moving along, conscious of time, quick update on China specifically, 3 slides here. Next slide, please. Chinese customs authorities, as of last year, issued notices to say that they would like, it's not mandated, but they are asking for GTIN identification on products. That's the same barcode identifier that we find in our supermarkets. And this is all about trade clearance and streamlining the process. So I've provided you with a link to the Chinese website. That's the Chinese General Administration of Customs. And that's been rolled out for containerized good movements, but it's also likely to be rolled out for e-commerce transactions. Next slide, please. What does that mean? Well, I won't go into the detail. I provided the example earlier. It's about providing information about products before they arrive in country, and that facilitates the trade clearance process. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. What are the benefits for industry? Well, we can either continue to do what we've always done, and our competing trading companies and partners will automate, and we'll be at a significant disadvantage because China are taking these actions, as are other countries, to realise benefit and savings. Next slide, please. We know that the benefits that automation is already providing the Australian red meat export sector are significant, well over $200 million a year in savings through the use of the meat messaging portal alone. If you don't know about the meat messaging portal, I suggest you look it up. AusMeat have been operating this system for some time with support from GS1, and it's very significant, and there are a number of changes coming into effect in November this year that you need to be aware of, and I imagine most of the processes are around relabeling the product. Next slide. Lastly, there is massive benefit. The government is focusing on realising. The current Prime Minister has been talking about regulatory automation for well over 6 or 7 years. So removing red tape and making Australia more competitive is certainly a focus as we trade our way out of COVID debt. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So with that background, what I'd like to do is to invite some of our panelists to share some of their perspectives and stories about experiences they've had. And I think that what we might do is we'll start with Charlie McDonald, given that we've been talking about China. Charlie, you've spent 2 years in China, and what have you seen? What have you seen? What's your observations, particularly around what's happening on the customer side, please?
Peter, yes, I've just came back. I came back, got out of quarantine in November last year. By the way, first of all, thank you very much for hosting this on behalf of Aglive. And I'd like to particularly thank Liz Pearson from Angus, Australia, for taking time out of her busy schedule this morning. Thank you. And good on you, Pierre, for sacrificing an hour you didn't have. Guys, look, I wanted to talk to you about, so kind of represent my personal experience of the consumer and what's happening in China. I mean, I think back 12 months, and 12 months ago, I was in isolation in Hong Kong, trying to get back into a so-called COVID-ridden China. And of course, during that March period of 2020, the world changed. It pivoted 180 degrees. China became safe, and everywhere else became infected. And landing back in there was an incredible experience, because in many ways, what COVID had done in China was what COVID did in terms of business disruption had already been trialed in SARS. And if we think about the product of SARS back that 10, 15 years ago in terms of disruption, it was the entry of these new companies called JD.com, called Alibaba. Now, roll forward to 2020, what is extraordinary now about the supply chain in China is the world-class performance of that supply chain is being driven by online retail. Similarly in North America, what Amazon has done to disrupt, but think of it just on steroids. So if there's a company you need to follow to understand what's happening in supply chain technology in China, go no further than Cainiao. Cainiao is Ali's supply chain platform. So it sits underneath all those marketplaces. It's doing only about 50 billion transactions a day. It's a small platform. It's only been around for about 5 years. Between Cainiao and JD, they are turning everything around. So I worked for a traditional freight forwarding 3PL in China. We found it incredibly difficult to keep up with the speed of innovation. I apologize because I'm out of date. I left China in October last year, and we're now March, and I'm probably, I've probably biodegraded in my knowledge of what's going on in the industry. It's extraordinary, Peter, and I don't know if you've, don't know GS1's view of that, but the speed and the scale is just extraordinary.
Charlie,
And the development of tier 2, yeah, go on.
Just to comment quickly, there's a lot of conversation about, what customers want and what they expect, etc. And for in Australia, looking through the lens we have about a centrally planned economy, what are you seeing? I mean, how important is that? What an individual customer would like to know about their product. How significant is that?
I personally take the view, and this is a personal view, that China is the world's largest capitalist country. Okay, the person sitting in Beijing works for the Communist Party, but actually the society is highly, highly entrepreneurial. So this is the most dynamic, most demanding, most cashed up marketplace in the world. I don't know if GS1 knows the stat. You mentioned the size of this middle class and this disposable income. What is it, 250 million? That was in October. It's probably 320 million now. A country of 1.3, 1.4 billion. This is an extraordinary marketplace. These are incredibly savvy consumers. They know what they want. They buy very shrewdly. They are digital natives. They don't know anything else other than WeChat. If you're not on WeChat, pack up and go home.
Charlie, that's a really good perspective. I think I'd like to hone in on this because it's very much the conversation that we're having in Australia around traceability is about information and making sure that information is what the customer's looking for, but it's also reliable. I'd like to throw it to Liz actually to talk about your experience in industry. You've called data integrity out as a really important issue. What have you learned from your experience and drawing on Charlie's insight from China?
Yeah, I think from our point of view, there's really a lot of information. I'm sorry, and before I get into that, thank you very much to Aglive for having me along and for GS1 for this webinar. From our point of view, it's really, I guess, it starts for us right at the farm level, right at the producer level. So being able to, I guess, have that traceability of information, and we're working with Aglive at the moment, developing a solution that's going to allow the collection of data and the integrity of that data, so that when producers and further down the supply chain start making claims about particular products, where they're from, what they are, then there's a bit of, I guess, integrity and trust. And in using blockchain technology to do that, it's been really, really important for us. So that making sure that whatever the consumer is after and having that confidence is really important, that we make sure we can provide what they need there. And as Charlie said, they know what they want, they know how to get it, but they also want proof that yes, it is what they say it is.
Liz, what about perspectives for producers in terms of, I think people understand the customers are sort of driving, it must be a really exciting opportunity to get direct feedback, from the market in terms of what they like and perhaps don't like about product. But
absolutely,
how do you think producers are looking at this?
I think the majority of producers would see it as an opportunity. I guess there's that level of, I've got to maybe record a bit more data and a bit more information and have a better recording system, but overarching that is that opportunity to become closer to the consumer. So to really build a better trust network between where the food's coming from and where the food's actually being consumed, and being able to trace that information along the supply chain, I think is really valuable for all sections of the supply chain from one end to the other. But I think a huge opportunity for those particularly looking to push their business forward and be able to market themselves better and step into the next phase.
Yeah, well, we're certainly seeing some really great examples of brands that no one really knew much about, and then all of a sudden you quietly find out that they're turning over, many millions of dollars, servicing a market that, it's outside of our field of view. Look, with that, what we might do is I'll ask Sandra if she might just cue the next part of the session, which is a video about one producer's story. Macca's Meats, I mentioned North Coast, New South Wales. It's got a very large operation, vertically integrated. So let's listen to what Macca has to say, and then I've got a few questions for Pierre. Thanks, Sandra.
Australians know how resilient our farmers are, how hard they work to get the best from our land, making vital economic and environmental contributions to our economy. But right now, Australian farmers are facing some enormous challenges. Droughts and fires, COVID and price pressures, our farmers are doing it tough. But in challenge lies opportunity. As industries around the world innovate to solve some of our most complex problems, Australia's farmers too can look forward to a brighter future. Introducing Aglive, a world-leading paddock-to-plate solution that's innovating the food supply chain process. It saves time by replacing old-fashioned NVD logbooks with an easy-to-use app. With one scan of a QR code, you can transfer custody of your stock. Imagine all that compliance paperwork done in just a few clicks. You can also upload any relevant data and documentation and make it available to all your stakeholders along the supply chain. The best part of all is that you now have a powerful new way to talk to your customers and communicate the valuable origin story of your product. Let's hear from Aglive Ambassador Macca, who's been using Aglive to help his farming business thrive in difficult times.
Macca's Australian Black Angus beef is a family operation, been going since 1884. Rich in history, passion and dedication for the beef industry. Australian agriculture is on the world stage for producing some of the highest quality product in the world. Our fresh, green, clean image is renowned for producing that high quality product from paddock to plate. We've experienced food fraud firsthand overseas, and it's crippling. It's crippling for us and it's crippling for our industry. There's so many products out there that are masking themselves as quality Australian products, where we know that they're not. They're actually fraudulent, cheaper imitations that carry and bear our brand, that's actually hurting the Australian dollar, the Australian exporter and the Australian farmer. The smart label system that's been developed by Aglive is unique. And when you scan it with your mobile phone, if it doesn't read, it'll come back and notify the consumer this may not be authentic Australian product. When it is the authentic Australian product, it can tell the consumer the whole story from paddock to plate, every step of the way through the processing chain, right at the shopping centre, right at their fingertips. So when they go purchasing quality Australian products, they are getting what they deserve.
We understand that our new future is challenging, but embracing new technology can make the world of difference to the way you run your farm. And we know Aussie farmers aren't ones to shy away from a challenge, but you've got our support. Aglive are on this journey with you, supporting Australia's farmers into a brighter future. And this is just the beginning. Aglive. Manage farms, not forms. Download the free app today.
Okay, nice little bit of promotion there and a nice story to tell. I should note that GES1, in supporting these sorts of events, doesn't necessarily advocate or promote one solution or another. We try to be as neutral as possible. But I think what that does is it actually wraps up a nice little conversation about, what industries, and not just the red meat industry, all agricultural industries have been talking about, and that is how we build trust and confidence in Australian brand. Each industry has often actually had their own conversation, and I think we are finding that these conversations are merging, because what the cotton industry needs is essentially the same as what the beef industry needs and the sugar industry. With that, I might ask Pierre for some perspectives on his experience. Now, Pierre's been working as a software engineer. I also, for my sins, manage a solution provider community that now is in excess of 100 organisations, all competing for a spot in the ecosystem to do their bit. Pierre, what are you seeing in the technology landscape? I think sometimes these stories can sometimes be a little simplified. They're emotive, and we need them to provide a direction and a vision. But what are you seeing in the engine room? Like, how quickly are we moving on? Where are the gaps?
So the main gaps that we're seeing throughout the industry is that everyone wants to come up with one solution that fixes everything. But as Charlie was saying earlier, the consumers out there are very, very sophisticated. And also your competitors and people who want to copy your stuff are also very, very competitive and very, very, very entrepreneurial. And they will go out and they will just make the website that you published, put it on their own brand and say, our stuff is legitimate as well. And they'll use all of your trademarks because they know that you're never going to be able to come out after them in time. You might get it shut down in a year, but that's the damage is already done. So you've got to have many, many steps. But the problem with having many, many steps is that that's a huge amount more workload for everyone. And if it's a huge amount more workload, then you're never going to get it done. So we've got to, it's all trying to simplify it down so that every time you do something, that's your normal process, that goes into your verification, that goes into everything. Try and make your life easier, try and make everyone's lives easier, and try and make the consumer's life easier, because your stuff can't be copied. Your stuff can't be.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, particularly, putting my hat on as a part-time sort of agriculturalist, is that, the mundane nature of, processing forms and vendor declarations and reporting to state agencies and etc. It can be tedious, and we need to concentrate on the value and the benefit that a producer perhaps gets immediately, because it's not immediately obvious, what value, say, blockchain provides for a producer. In actual fact, I think our experience is suggesting that many become fearful of, losing information or exposing commercially sensitive data to other parties. So how are you seeing that part of the conversation unravel?
So this is one of the, this is part of the Aglive secret sauce, which is making sure that your data is verifiable, but also keeping the private things private. And then when you need to expose those to a customer or to someone down your supply chain, to be able for them to, unravel that data and tell that it's, tell that it's genuine as well. And that, there's many stages of that. There's also a big problem with, blockchain in particular, where a customer isn't going to look at their phone waiting for a minute for it to all verify through. So you've got to make sure that it's very quick. And that's actually a very difficult thing to do with blockchain. So again, a lot of work has to go into that.
Thanks, Pierre. I'd like to throw to Charlie maybe, and Liz, you might have a view, but I'd also like to encourage anyone on the call. I can see that there's a few questions that are already coming in. So if you have any questions you'd like to put to any of the panelists or myself, jump on the chat channel or direct them to the panelists. Charlie, we've been banging away in Australia, and the media love to pick up a story of, Ben Folds wines, here's another, another case of food fraud, and, poor old China are an easy target to pick on, perhaps. Did you see, are we overplaying food fraud as opposed to the benefits of just automating supply chains and making them more efficient? What do you think?
Oh, look, as Pierre mentioned, the bad guys have probably got more money than the good guys. So, I think, well, whether we overplay for fraud, I don't think we can ever overplay that. I mean, we've been seeing publicity that people are producing copied fake COVID antiviral stuff. I mean, this stuff is is reprehensible, isn't it? So this is always going to exist. I think how we approach it, and for us, so this provenance as a service is so important that the win for us is not necessarily, the win is we've got to answer both of these things. We've got to digitalize and make it easier, and that's really what Liz has been championing and bringing us along on that journey. If we can do both, right? Here's the first prize is we make it more efficient for the producer. So by digitalizing the process, we're going to make it more efficient. The upstream benefit of that at the consumer end is more visibility and more security. So we're looking at there's three ideas of this: identity, condition, and location. That is the core to what we're proving in our supply chain. And a lot of what you were talking about, GS1, it's interesting, you bringing location into that HS code and the clearance thing. It's another layer of validity on something that was just purely a commodity declaration, right? So I don't think it's one or the other. It's got to be both.
Liz, have you got any comments? There's another question that's just come in, I think, that I might throw out there, and I think it's a good one, and it's right between the eyes. Aglive and its competitors, are essentially adding a little extra cost into the supply chain for production and management of information, etc. Producers and processors just want to understand the payoff. How does that extra cost get returned, whether it's blockchain or other traceability systems? So the question, the attendee is asking for demonstrable evidence that there is value to be returned to producers. And do you have the case studies? And where is the ROI calculator here? Liz, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think, and it's a really good question, and it's a really fair question. And I think really where we're in a lot of spaces, we're starting from that space where there really has been quite a lot of looseness around what's been coming from the very start of the supply chain. And when I say looseness, it's not that people are purposely doing the wrong thing, but no doubt there's a level of that out there as well. But actually having confidence that something is what they say it is. So I know that a few people might have been a little bit, it almost might have scared some of the producers who are on this webinar that, we're going to digitize everything and make it so you can't just write it down in the cattle yards. And, we understand the reality of that side of what needs to be done as well. But what it actually does do is, I guess there's that small period of reorganization, or I must call a small period of pain, that actually leads to quite a bit of payoff and time efficiency being one of those things past that point, but also having information that you can share in a I guess a secure space. And then I actually believe that the market is really going to dictate what's going to happen with this project that we're working on, which hopefully we'll be able to tell everyone about very, very shortly. But that kind of a, not necessarily cost the market more, but maybe a correction of the marketplace. So where things are being passed off as something when they're not necessarily that, whereas now with this new program being able to actually have proof that they are. And I think that correction is really what might, I guess, level out the market. So, you've got one end of the supply chain. So if we talk about the producer and the feedlotter, for example, and then the processor. So you've got one end of the supply chain might be getting a premium for something. Then the next level in the supply chain being the feedlotter, who've paid that premium, then can't necessarily sell for the same premium because the product's not as what was described. And then again for the processor. So the leveling out of being able to make sure that all levels of the supply chain in that production end up to a processor, I think is actually going to be corrected. And making it so that everyone in the supply chain is going to make sure that they can gain premiums that are deserved and genuine. And then those costs that were being incurred for products that aren't genuine, those costs will obviously reduce. So there's a bit of leveling out and correction to happen.
I think the attendee who's anonymous asked a really good question, and I will call this out. Actually, is that the one of the things that GS1 has been doing recently is looking for evidence of traceability delivering value. And so we've done and I'd invite anyone who's interested in this, actually, I'll make a plug at the end of the call. We have a national forum where we invite industry to come and talk about topics and priorities, and return on investment and evidence to support the transformation that's occurring is really a high priority. And we're sharing some insights from the global seafood industry. And they've observed that as information is redistributed across the supply chain, so too is power and benefit. So this is something that I think is going to become really topical in the future.
And Peter, I mean, you're right. This is such a good question about the ROI here. I mean, I've been in the industry, in the transport industry for many years, and I remember, back in the day with DHL when track and trace was first coming in, and there was a real question about whether that was really what was the internal benefit to the business of being able to give a customer live status information. This is 20, 30 years ago. And that then became, I think it became hygiene. It just became part of the product. If you want to be an express package, international distribution, that's what you've got to do. It's part of the features of this product. I firmly believe that this is, right now, there's an ROI step and question, which is totally valid. But really, do we have an option here in terms of traceability, in terms of giving everyone down the supply chain the visibility of the product? There's lots of choices of different solutions, I'm sure, and there's lots of different ways of doing it.
A great comment's just been come through the chat channel as well. Elvis, I believe, haven't seen him for a while, made the note that we can't take our foot off the pedal in terms of making sure that our brands are protected by evidence, science and technology. And I suppose the pathway to benefit there is if we do that well and consistently, then we've got a stronger ability to extract a premium price. So that's hopefully going to benefit everyone in the supply chain. Did have another question that came up. And it was to do with, so this is from Neil McCartney. Sorry, I think I pronounced that incorrectly. But he makes mention of the fact that last year, or in 2019, at a global table forum, I think GS1 put forward the view that traceability systems, that compliance and surety data shouldn't be commercialized. And he's just asking if we've changed our view on that. Not particularly what's its relevance here. Don't think we've changed our view on it. There's two parts to this. One is quality assurance, and the other one is regulatory oversight. And quality assurance, I think, in the meat sector is already very well managed. And as it relates to regulatory aspects, then governments, states and territory are all very focused on streamlining. I think there's an emerging sense that there's a mutual responsibility here for industry through the adoption of digital systems and ideally open standards so that there's interoperability between those digital systems, is that government can't do it on their own and industry can't do it on their own. So what we are likely to see in the future with respect to compliance and surety is we're likely to see more cooperative models for industry regulation come to be. And it may very well have a very significant impact on the competitiveness of our industry in terms of how well we do that. I want to touch on the issue of ecosystems and maybe ask Pierre his comment on this, is that I'm increasingly of the view that no one company can actually provide everything that's required. What's Aglive's view on that? I know you want to conquer the world with your product, but
yeah, definitely. So this is actually also part of our marketing, is that our brand doesn't mean nearly as much to your customers as your brand does. And that is very important to us, and we acknowledge it. All we're trying to do is provide trust. And there's other companies that you want to use for that. And we are, we're building things to integrate with those companies. So integrating with various traceability, Internet of Things devices that will trace your product as it moves around the world. All of those things. We're not the solution for end-to-end. We are just part of the process that you're going to have.
Yep. Hello. Thank you for those comments.
Peter, sorry, Peter, can I add one thing? Is we don't intend to commercialize that data. Your data is your data. That isn't. We're just this. We're this provenance and trust layer. Your data is yours, and that's been really important, Liz, for you guys, isn't it? It's not. Aglive is an enabling platform here. We're not making a quid out of the data.
And I think, Charlie, that's a good comment. I think the maturity of our conversation around things like end-to-end supply chain, what does that mean? Like what end-to-end traceability or blockchain? I think it is changing as we're realizing that that doesn't necessarily mean revealing, commercially sensitive information. It's simply the fact that we can do a better job than having a one up, one down reporting and response regime. There's some other interesting comments that have come up through the chat channel. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes to go. I would ask if there's any other questions that people have, if they want to put it to the panel now, or if we don't get time to get back to them, we can certainly follow up. As I did mention, we'll be distributing a session recording. Got a quick question here from Elvis again. Aglive seems to allow users to identify once they have received the product. Can you see any possibilities for identifying this at point of trade or even negotiation? One for you, Pierre.
Definitely. So again, this is part of the your data is your data approach. All of the data that you store with us, which can be certificates, can be locations, can be really anything, is available whenever you need it. And we're very, very happy to write integrations if it needs to be automated. Just have the reporting there for you, if that's the part. It's, we're happy to, well, it's not even we're happy to, we are working on these things and making sure that the data is available for your use cases.
Thanks, Pierre. Can I ask you a question, just in terms of particularly solutions, and there are so many of them that are using a simple QR code pointing to a website. Have you had the conversation about how foreign jurisdictions feel about the activities of citizens in those countries being, those activities being reported back to, that or companies like yours, where are they based? What time of the day did they scan their product? Has that come up in your conversations?
Sorry, who's that question to?
I think it's probably maybe one for Charlie and for Pierre, actually.
Okay, so I to be honest, we haven't had that experience in my Aglive career. I mean, obviously, I've lived in a country where personal confidentiality is not such a huge issue as it is in the Western world, and which is one of the reasons they've been so efficient in responding to COVID, right? So I think data sovereignty, data security is incredibly important, and we need to, if data sovereignty, i.e. where is the data being hosted, where is the activity on that data being done? The strength of the blockchain platform is around this security. This is a highly distributed network, highly secure, and that is what we're able to produce. Now, I'm not sure if governments have a slightly different view on that, Peter, if that's what you're...
Yeah, maybe there's no quick answer to that question, but I think it's an emerging issue that will likely need to be navigated by solution providers like Aglive, and there are so many available in market today, is that with that note, unless there are any other questions that people would like to put to the panel, I might sort of begin with a bit of a close, but also with an invitation and a plug for increased understanding of standards and how we navigate global supply chains. So what I will do is, for anyone on the call who is interested in learning more about the development of traceability systems in China, on the 16th of next month, the 16th of this month, coming up very soon, the National Traceability Advisory Group, I can send out a link to that address, is convening a session on traceability systems and trade modernisation with a focus on China. Australia is in an extraordinarily strong position. If you look at the developments in New Zealand in the last 6 months, their free trade agreement. The other perspective is that Australia at the moment is still sitting at 106th out of 160 countries in terms of ease of doing business. New Zealand is sitting about 3rd. And a big part of this is the cost of processing cross-border transactions. So there is enormous opportunity for Australia to improve the way that we are clearing product with our Asian trading partners. You know, we're 1/3 more expensive than Asian, and we're 6 times more expensive than our European high-income counterparts in terms of the documentation and the processing cost. So the future certainly is looking very bright for the Australian red meat industry if we can help government and industry reduce those barriers to trade and the cost of doing business. With that, I would like to thank our panelists for coming today. Hopefully the information that we've been able to share has been useful for everyone concerned. I'd like to thank Aglive for organising the event. Charlie, thank you for your insights in China. It's always great to see your face and smile. Liz, your perspectives, and particularly the questions around the ROI, that I don't think we can ever not concentrate on that enough. I think there was a great question that came in from the group. To my point, the meeting on the 16th, which is next week of the NTAG, is going to look at ROI calculators for traceability. So anyone who's interested in that, I will make sure that you've got a link after this call. And Pierre, I'd also like to thank you for your perspectives and plug for Aglive. And of course, Macca, I think he does a great job. You always need a storyteller. And I really would like one of his belt buckles, if you can arrange that, that would be what. With that, Sandra and the Aglive team, thank you. It's been a pleasure hosting the conversation. Let's do more of this in the future. And I thank everyone for their time today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. Well done. Thanks, everybody.